Welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, which is a partnership between War on the Rocks and the University of Texas at Austin. My name is Nicholas Danforth, and I'm an editor at War on the Rocks. What follows is Aaron O'Connell, Director of Research for the Clements Center, hosting a discussion with Rob Rakove, an expert on U.S. Cold War foreign relations at Stanford. Professor Rakove will be talking about the United States and Afghanistan before the cataclysm of the Russian invasion. And now, on to the show.
Thanks so much, Aaron. Thanks so much to everyone at the Clements Center, including and especially Elizabeth and Paul. Austin is not quite a second home, but I've spent a lot of quality time here researching the earlier book back in a kind of halcyon age when the Toy Joy stood around 29th and Ruby's was still open. So it's a warm and friendly place for me. With all that said, I'd love to begin and introduce you to the interesting world of pre-cataclysm Afghanistan. On April 15, 1965, in Kabul, Afghanistan, U.S. Ambassador John Milton Steeves set out to write a very difficult letter to his superiors in Washington, lamenting the halting implementation of aid and his government's deepening frugality. He opted to include a dire warning, one that I think takes on an unintended new meaning in the current century. I fancy that we may have to pay a much higher price one day to try and retrieve what we are losing in a day of opportunity. I encountered this haunting sentence very early in the process of researching this book. It lingered with me, and of course, it inspired the title. It often also stands in sharp contrast to the ubiquitous American image of Afghanistan today, shaped by decades of warfare and the now pervasive characterization of the country as a graveyard of empires. Colleagues and audiences whom I encountered seemed incredulous that Afghanistan could ever have been otherwise, a view at sharp odds with the hopes and aspirations I often found in the archives. The Afghanistan my protagonists encountered had carefully navigated its way through successive global conflicts while courting patrons near and far. It had witnessed profound and dizzying transformation, and some in the early 1970s described it in the Cold War as a paragon of successful neutrality, staying off of either camp of the Cold War while reaping benefits from both. For many of my protagonists, pre-cataclysm Afghanistan was the furthest thing from a graveyard of empires. It was a place of opportunity. Opportunity and its pursuit constitute one of several unifying threads of the book. I felt a need to explain what drew the United States to Afghanistan, why successive presidents authorized hundreds of millions of dollars in aid, why Henry Kissinger visited Kabul twice in a 2-year period, and why the Carter administration reacted as it did to the Marxist coup of 1978. Fear by itself, on the other hand, would have been a less compelling explanation. Americans acted not merely to stave off worse outcomes, but also to pursue desired objectives. At different points in time, they and others perceived opportunities in Afghanistan and accordingly attached a greater significance to the country. Otherwise, the difficulties presented by Afghanistan might have seemed overwhelming. Its distance, poverty, governance, and proximity to the Soviet Union could have easily argued for a more detached approach, one that sought to contain the problems posed by Afghanistan rather than contest the country's future. At specific points during the Cold War, American observers did indeed contemplate cutting their losses. Notably, they never did, not before the coup of 1978. Exploring the continued pursuit of opportunity within Afghanistan, I'd like to discuss 5 episodes. Wartime diplomacy in Kabul, the post-war influx of Americans in Afghanistan with a central emphasis on the Morrison Knudsen construction firm, the aid contest of the 1950s, the Afghan constitutional experiment between 1963 and 1973, and lastly, the beginnings of the violent superpower confrontation in Afghanistan in 1979. Taken together, these encounters help to describe Afghanistan's arc within international politics and the value ascribed to it by superpower patrons. They cover the temporal scope of my book, albeit unevenly, allowing me to explore specific events but obligating me to leapfrog over others. A focus on opportunity and opportunism, lastly, largely precludes an emphasis on grand strategy. This is a choice. I think this is a story of improvisation and often of misperception, but not of Afghanistan's deliberate incorporation into one or another strategic doctrine. For Americans, the country was too small, distant, and unfamiliar to figure prominently in any major strategic statement. Rather, policy toward Afghanistan represented a series of adaptations toward a country that rarely fit into any preordained category. Afghanistan required exceptions to rules formulated on abstract, idealized principles. The policy problems it presented resisted resolution, but could be managed on a year-to-year basis. Remarkably, they were for much of the Cold War, but the intertwined pursuit of opportunity by Americans, by their Soviet adversaries, and by Afghans themselves, of course, ultimately undermined the country's non-alignment and the stability of its government. It's worth noting that for 20 years, the U.S. government discerned little opportunity in Afghanistan. In 1921, President Warren G. Harding and Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes welcomed an extraordinary Afghan delegation to the White House. The Afghans had hoped to gain diplomatic leverage from contact with the United States to apply against the United Kingdom in the wake of the Third Anglo-Afghan War, their war of independence against the Crown. Secretary of State Hughes advised Harding, however, that Britain still regarded Afghanistan as lying squarely within its sphere of influence. Commercial opportunities within the Afghan kingdom appeared extremely limited. Those meetings conferred recognition in the most basic sense, but Washington declined repeated Afghan requests to establish more robust relations or to open a diplomatic facility in Kabul. Policy calcified for the following decade, particularly under the stewardship of one Wallace Murray, who headed the State Department's Near East Division. Pressed to explain his resistance to broadening the relationship, Murray wrote, "I can't for the life of me see any useful purpose in encouraging Americans to become involved in such a hopeless part of the world as Afghanistan." Others, however, felt differently. Murray received regular inquiries from U.S. diplomats elsewhere in the world who had just spoken to a very friendly Afghan representative, or from U.S. investors touting one or another purported economic concession in Afghanistan. These contacts attested to Kabul's persistent efforts to attract affluent, non-contiguous patrons to balance against the British and Soviet empires. Eventually, the Afghans succeeded in wearing down Murray's resistance. The two countries signed an executive agreement in 1936. When Afghanistan offered an oil concession to a U.S. firm, Murray resigned himself to opening a legation in Kabul, but then a confluence of factors caused that whole oil scheme to collapse. 4 more years would pass before U.S. diplomats reached Kabul. When they did, they arrived against the backdrop of the Second World War. Franklin Roosevelt's extension of Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union necessitated consideration of potential supply routes. Improbably, this included the possibility of aiding the Soviets through Afghanistan. Thus, in spring 1942, a handful of junior diplomats drove east from Tehran in what must have been one of the most amazing road trips in history, across bumpy roads in a motor bus. Expecting fuel to be scarce, they carried 200 gallons of their own gasoline with them. Joining them weeks later in Kabul was Cornelius Engert, a veteran diplomat whose wartime service fundamentally transformed the Afghan relationship with the United States. Even by the standards of his day, Engert led an unusually eventful life, witnessing the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, the Balkan Wars, the Chinese Civil War, and the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. Notably, he had visited Kabul on his own dime in 1920, where he stayed for a month in the King's Guest House and compiled a trip report afterward. By dint of his own energy and a very peculiar lack of competition, he remained the State Department's in-house expert on Afghanistan in the succeeding decades. His appointment as minister in Kabul provided a long-awaited dividend for the Afghan government's efforts to engage individual U.S. diplomats. Afghanistan would have no more valuable friend within the U.S. State Department. Upon his arrival in Kabul, Engert faced a baffling array of diplomatic challenges, atop the normal problem of starting a diplomatic mission from scratch without the amenities available to his counterparts elsewhere. He wrote at one point, "When can we expect typewriters?" This was a fundamental logistical problem he had because he had virtually nothing to start a diplomatic mission with. His logistical difficulties, though, illuminated the far broader problem of scarcity in wartime Afghanistan. The war had severed Kabul's links to trading partners in Europe, while a combination of shortages and punitive policy had limited the supply of crucial materials from British India. From copper wiring to laboratory microscopes, Afghanistan's economy depended upon a wide array of manufactured imports. Among the Allies, only the United States could conceivably meet the kingdom's economic needs, yet a vast Byzantine wartime bureaucracy in Washington closely regulated exports. Afghans and Americans alike struggled to make sense of the convoluted export regulation regime, while the kingdom's economy entered an inflationary spiral. Engert and his staff lobbied incessantly in favor of Afghan economic necessities, pitting Kabul's requests against those of the U.S. military, the civilian economy, and Lend-Lease allies. Obviously, they couldn't win on each and every battle, but at times their lobbying helped to limit the damage inflicted on Afghanistan's wartime economy, especially their procurement late in the war of some 450 trucks. Engert's battles with the wartime commerce regime could have easily consumed his mission's scarce resources, but he looked as well to his government's position in a post-war Afghanistan. Transmitting an Afghan request for American teachers, he wrote, "We have a rare opportunity, not only of access to a new nation in the making, but of helping and guiding it in connection with the intimate problem of mental and moral adjustment, which the pressure of modern forces have created." Engert worked energetically to promote American products and ideas in Afghanistan by distributing books and magazines, providing relief aid after floods racked Kabul province, and by staging film screenings that often tactfully avoided some of the mores of the avoided challenging the mores of the Kabul government, and also a wartime ban on propaganda. Engert's efforts to fill the void left by expelled Axis engineers, however, proved most consequential over the long run and lead us into the post-war era. In 1943, bowing to Allied pressure, the Kabul government had expelled 4 Japanese engineers who were employed on an irrigation project along the Helmand River. Afterward, Engert had endeavored to find Americans to replace them. As a stopgap measure, his government dispatched John Lucian Savage, the chief designing engineer of the Interior Department's Bureau of Reclamation, to survey the project. Little could be done in wartime. Qualified engineers were another scarce resource, but Savage almost certainly put the Afghans in touch with the Morrison Knudsen construction firm, a giant of projects in the West whose president was a close friend and protege. Much like Engert, Morrison Knudsen perceived considerable opportunity in post-war Afghanistan, but the firm's headlong plunge into an uncharted foreign market bore vast and dangerous geopolitical consequences. Morrison Knudsen had profited considerably during the war. It was bolstered by a stream of government contracts. It had a very formidable lobbying apparatus in Washington, which it employed when the negotiations with the Kabul government kicked off in 1946. When the Afghans insisted that the firm guarantee its work for about 5 years, a reasonable request to my ears, MK, Morrison Knudsen's chief lobbyist, swung into action. The State Department directed its representatives in Kabul to use their good offices to get the Afghans to drop that demand. The two parties reached terms in early 1946, committing Morrison Knudsen to undertake a wide array of infrastructure projects, especially a combined irrigation and hydroelectric scheme along the Helmand. A list of Morrison Knudsen's mistakes by itself would easily fill this hour. Some of the firm's misfortune did stem from circumstances beyond its control. Other problems, however, attested to its inexperience and gross indifference to questions of cost. Crucially, its contract with the Afghan government operated on a cost-plus basis, not binding the firm to any set expense. Thus, with little apparent forethought, Morrison Knudsen spent millions shipping heavy construction equipment to Afghanistan, where it largely sat dormant. Its personnel consumed fuel prodigiously, even as Afghanistan underwent repeated gasoline shortages. MK fell woefully behind on its schedule, while its cost estimates ballooned alarmingly, reaching multiples of 6 or 7 times the figures presented in 1946. This just happened within a few years. By 1949, they had a vastly different set of much larger estimates. Plainly put, the Afghans were being bilked. One U.S. diplomat later complained that MK could convince itself of the necessity of paving a road diagonally across Afghanistan if there was a profit to be made from it. Fuel shortages and cost overruns were, though, far from the worst implication of the contract, but by the late 1940s, they posed a significant difficulty for the United States. Contemplating a global Cold War against the Soviet Union, U.S. diplomats perceived national prestige to be at stake. Should the MK effort founder, the blame would inevitably fall on Washington's doorstep, discrediting the United States within the wider region. State Department officials had ironically hoped that the firm would free them from Afghan requests for assistance. Instead, they found themselves compelled to come to its rescue. Under considerable pressure from the State Department and MK, the Export-Import Bank in Washington grudgingly approved a $21 million loan to Washington. Moscow took note. Worse from the Soviet perspective were the activities of the U.S.-led United Nations Technical Assistance Mission within Afghanistan, especially its exploration of oil resources in the north of the country. Establishing an Afghan oil industry might have alleviated local scarcity, but Moscow made its unease very plain. And bear in mind, they had also been trying to gain prevailing interests in Iranian oil development in northern Iran. So this was part and parcel of a broader pattern of behavior. In vain, French and British diplomats warned their governments that the U.S.-backed pursuit of northern oil risked antagonizing the Kremlin. Their communist bloc opponents within Kabul were sending frenetic warnings of Kabul being conscripted into the capitalist bloc. And thus, in August 1952, Stalin's government bluntly warned the Afghans against initiating any foreign-backed oil projects in the north. Morrison Knudson's pursuit of Afghan opportunities had by extension drawn Afghanistan into the global Cold War. In fairness, Afghan officials had played their own role in this development. As a British suzerainty and then as an independent kingdom pinned between India and the Soviet Union, Afghanistan had a long and celebrated history of navigating between geopolitical blocs. It practiced non-alignment before the term attained currency and balance between opposing sides during both world wars. Decades of experience bequeathed Afghan elites with the means to exploit great power conflict, to turn their relative weakness into a geopolitical asset. Bereft of the funding and institutional support enjoyed by their counterparts, Afghan diplomats proved masterful at gaining the sympathy of others, at cultivating it. Although the Soviet démarche of 1952 shocked the Kabul government, the arrival of the Cold War offered the kingdom a historic opportunity to enlist the support of both blocs. Americans had already pledged themselves to assist in Afghan development. Now their Soviet adversaries raced to offer their own counterbid. Thus, from 1953 onward, Afghanistan emerged as an early site of symbolic competition between the superpowers. Washington continued to founder in the Helmand Valley, where early efforts to settle Pashtun nomads ran afoul of administrative disorder, a dearth of housing, and most unforgivably, Morrison Knudson's decision to develop land with high saline and alkaline concentrations. If the firm had conducted soil surveys when it was moving toward the contract, it kept the results to itself, but other observers, as far back as 1945, had noted alarming concentrations of surface salts on the ground. Irrigation by inexperienced settlers further damaged the soil. A visiting British diplomat wrote in the early 1950s, "I have seldom seen a more dismal sight than this tract of land, either barren or scarred with salt patches or bearing obviously stunted crops." Morrison Knudson's failure in the Helmand bore several consequences. Firstly, it served to undermine the government of Prime Minister Shah Mahmud, uncle to King Mohammad Zahir Shah, and in 1953, Kabul radio announced Shah Mahmud's resignation and his replacement by Prime Minister Mohammad Daoud Khan, the king's first cousin. Secondly, it impelled the Truman and Eisenhower administrations to undertake emergency action to salvage the U.S. position in Afghanistan. Notions of the kingdom's Cold War significance remained embryonic, ill-defined in the early 1950s, but its history as an invasion route into India offered one ready-made argument for its relevance. Angus Ward, a staunchly anti-communist ambassador sent to Kabul in 1952, argued, moreover, that failure in the Helmand would have wider implications. He wrote very dramatically, even melodramatically, "The eyes not only of Afghanistan, but of the entire area from the Mediterranean Ocean," his words, "to the Bay of Bengal and from the Indian to the Arctic Oceans are upon us." After a brief but very unpleasant captivity in the People's Republic of China, earlier in his career, Angus Ward was a minor celebrity in the United States, and his warnings, therefore, could not be ignored by the incoming Eisenhower administration. Thirdly, and most decisively, the Soviet Union now perceived its own opportunities in Afghanistan. After Joseph Stalin's March 1953 death, his successors favored the carrot over the stick in their Afghan diplomacy. Moscow funded the construction of grain silos, then a bakery in Kabul, and a major propaganda coup. They paved the streets of the Afghan capital. Soviet bloc diplomats had noted growing Afghan disaffection with Morrison Knudsen. Here in this instance, the communists could come by their outrage honestly. The firm's missteps and Afghanistan's mounting debt burden presented a horrifying picture of the rapacious capitalist exploitation of an impoverished country. They also offered the bloc an invaluable opportunity. The communists could distinguish themselves as prompt, respectful, and egalitarian benefactors of the Afghan people. The Soviets also drew upon their own very distinctive history, the very distinctive history of relations between the Bolshevik revolutionaries and the Afghan kingdom. To First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev, Afghanistan held a special significance. As a neighbor and a monarchy, with actually a very historic suspicion of Russian power, the kingdom offered his government a unique showcase, an opportunity to proclaim that its development assistance came free of political strings. Visiting Kabul in December 1955, Khrushchev enthusiastically proclaimed a $100 million loan to support Afghan development. The U.S. Embassy glumly predicted that Afghanistan would soon become an effective satellite of the Soviet Union. Such prognoses overstated Soviet ambitions and underrated Afghan diplomacy. Prime Minister Daoud also worked to reassure the United States that it could play a role in his country's development. Having anxiously considered the possibility of Afghanistan's absorption into the bloc, the Eisenhower administration ultimately decided to take a chance on the country. That choice is notable. Allied governments in Iran and in Pakistan distrusted Daoud, who had fostered nationalist grievances against both neighbors. Pakistan had closed the border for several months in 1955 after an Afghan mob ransacked its Kabul embassy. The Pakistani government especially questioned the rationale for continued engagement of Afghanistan, arguing that it rewarded Daoud for bad behavior. Eisenhower held both of these allies, Iran and Pakistan, in very high esteem, and he could have easily chosen to consign Afghanistan to Moscow. Instead, he embraced the notion that Afghan nationalism could, if bolstered by U.S. assistance, withstand Soviet pressures. He did not believe that he could compete with the Soviets on an equal footing in a country so close to their borders and so far from his own, but he resolved to at least offer a symbolic response to Moscow's widening Afghan aid program. He chose, in short, to venture what he could in Afghanistan and hope for the best. In the near term, Eisenhower's bet bore surprising dividends. Washington's Helmand struggles continued, but Afghan officials courted and accepted U.S. bids on development projects elsewhere in the country. The United States continued to play a central role in the Afghan education system, where the Soviets hadn't yet gained any purchase. After earlier impromptu efforts, the United States began offering Afghanistan deliveries of supplies of surplus wheat under the new PL-480 program, later known as Food for Peace. Above all, assisted by Pan American Airways, the United States took the lead role in developing Afghan aviation. Pan Am provided technical assistance toward the development of a national airline, Ariana, while Washington funded the construction of a lavish but not much used airport in Kandahar in the south. When Daoud, once the subject of profound suspicion in Washington, embarked upon a national tour of the United States, ranging from the White House to Disneyland, it constituted a victory lap of sorts. Afghanistan reaped generous aid from both blocs, advancing Daoud's ambitious modernization agenda. In the longer term, though, the benefits of the Afghan aid race proved questionable for all interested parties. The Afghans seemingly delighted in playing the superpowers off against each other. Both blocs understood this. Both blocs grasped the problem of blackmail, as Americans termed it, but they usually found a compelling reason to bid for individual projects. In one very rare instance of mutual restraint, both declined to finance an Afghan railroad. Nikita Khrushchev told one Afghan envoy, "You don't have enough cargo for a railroad." Within Afghanistan, project spending had inflationary consequences. The central government struggled to raise internal revenue, and it often encountered really intense local-level resistance. In southern Afghanistan, rural landlords questioned the value of these projects and really resented the newly stringent taxation regime. In 1959, a riot racked Kandahar, forcing U.S. aid workers to seek shelter until the Afghan army arrived in Soviet-made tanks to disperse the mob. Concurrently, Daoud continued to challenge Pakistan. Kabul had long contended that its neighbor's Pashtun population deserved national self-determination, but it had pursued this campaign fitfully and without a consistent objective. Curiously, at one point, his brother, Foreign Minister Mohammad Naim Khan, had explored the possibility of an Afghan-Pakistan federation. There was in the mid-50s a 2-year thaw in bilateral relations between the two neighbors, which bolstered U.S. hopes that détente could be achieved between the two of them. But the ascendancy of Pakistani President Mohammad Ayub Khan via a coup brought a renewed phase of confrontation and violence to the Pashtun borderlands. The conflict lacked an immediate Cold War valence, but the two antagonists found ways to involve the superpowers. After a Peshawar-based U-2 spy plane, of course the one piloted by Captain Francis Gary Powers, was downed over Siberia, having first overflown Afghanistan, Kabul accused Pakistan of bringing the Cold War into the borderlands. Interestingly, they spoke very mildly to the United States, but they faulted Pakistan. The escalation of U.S.-Soviet tensions over Berlin in summer 1961, meanwhile, gave Ayub the leverage he needed to confront the Afghans. His shuttering of Afghan consulates led to a second, more serious border closure, one which lasted into 1963 and ultimately drove Daoud from power. By the time the Afghan-Pakistani border had reopened, Afghanistan faced a changed international environment. By spring 1963, its two superpower patrons, having nearly reached the brink of nuclear war the preceding autumn, were wary of conflict elsewhere in the world. Soviet diplomats in Kabul suggested that their government would no longer look very indulgently on Afghanistan's Pashtunistan campaign. In Washington, meanwhile, President Kennedy's final foreign aid bill faced an increasingly hostile reception. Under such circumstances, Daoud's successors would not enjoy the same leverage. The Afghan contest had lost much of its prior urgency. That didn't keep aid programs from advancing. Numerous U.S. projects had stalled during the closure and were brought to fruition after commerce resumed, including the central campus of Kabul University and a highway that linked Kabul and Kandahar. Nevertheless, neither geopolitics nor the congressional mood favored further grand designs in countries like Afghanistan. While Lyndon Johnson's growing involvement in Southeast Asia precluded further steps towards superpower détente, earlier notions from the 40s or the 50s of a Soviet drive, a military invasion through Afghanistan towards South Asia, those faded from view. Those lacked the same persuasive power by the mid-1960s. Johnson himself evinced less interest in the subcontinent than his predecessor and had no time whatsoever for Afghanistan. That didn't keep Americans within Afghanistan from discerning new possibilities after Daoud's downfall. Alarmed by the overthrow of monarchies elsewhere in the Islamic world, King Zahir had sought to separate his family from day-to-day governance within the country. Daoud's successor as Prime Minister, Mohammad Yusuf, appointed a commission to draft a new constitution, and the Afghan kingdom began a decade-long, very remarkable constitutional experiment. The draft document was presented in the following year in 1964 and approved by Aloya Jirga, an extraordinary tribal assembly. It barred members of the royal family from holding governmental office. It established a bicameral elected legislature. And notably, through, I think, very careful wording, it elevated secular law over Islamic law while still affirming the principles of the latter. The White House sent a congratulatory message to the king, expressing the hope that the Afghan constitution would prove an inspiration to the many peoples and countries elsewhere in the world who share our ideals. In such circumstances, even without those Cold War imperatives that have been so powerful in the 1950s, or without firm budgetary support, Americans in Afghanistan perceived opportunity. John Steeves, previously mentioned, who had arrived in Kabul during the border crisis, hoped to pursue reforms that would bolster Yusuf's government and support the long-term development of the Afghan economy. Discerning a more technocratic approach in Kabul, he advised the Afghans that the Afghans could be counseled away from those gaudy, expensive, capital-intensive projects of the 1950s, which would ultimately strain their own finances, toward more basic endeavors that would improve local administration, improve rural communications, and boost Afghanistan's export revenue. He wrote, Ideologically, the desires and ambitions of the people of this country, as far as they can define them, are oriented to the West, urging that aid be maintained on its present level. As we've heard above, he would soon be disappointed. Congressional skepticism toward foreign aid deepened over the 60s, and LBJ himself proved reluctant to defend the program. U.S. allocations to Afghanistan thinned as the country embarked upon the constitutional experiment. It held elections in the late summer of 1965. By that point, of course, Johnson had committed U.S. forces to the military defense of South Vietnam, and his unfolding war posed a further problem for the U.S.-Afghan relationship. Kabul's burgeoning student population opposed the war, while Afghanistan, which was of course a charter member of the non-aligned movement, advocated a ceasefire and negotiations. After one Afghan prime minister, Mohammad Hashim Maiwandwal, called for a bombing halt while visiting Washington, an incensed Lyndon Johnson made all further aid to Afghanistan. All of these amounts were small at this point in time, subject to his approval. Johnson's ire delayed the provision of grain shipments in 1967 and 1968 as Kabul grappled with poor harvests and spiraling grain prices. Food insecurity would loom over Afghanistan as the constitutional experiment began to founder. King Zahir bore much of the blame for this. He had failed to approve the formation of political parties, and in their absence, the Afghan parliament assumed an unruly, at times riotous, quality. Rambunctious students from Kabul University at times contributed to the atmosphere. The successes of the 1965 elections and the subsequent opening of the parliament were overshadowed by the tragic killing of 5 student demonstrators in Kabul on October 25, 1965. Zahir also retained the responsibility of appointing prime ministers, and he unfailingly chose officials without great popular standing, who are often, coincidentally or not, in bad health. The king clearly hoped to prevent the emergence of a rival political faction, but meager harvests, economic stagnation, and acrimonious politics sapped any popular enthusiasm for democratization. Famine struck Afghanistan at the turn of the 1970s. The king's planning minister requested the sale of 100,000 tons of wheat under the Food for Peace program. And to the frustrated U.S. mission, which had been goading the Afghans to undertake agricultural reforms for years, the moment was ripe. The U.S. had been planning for years for the possibility of global famines, anticipating that overpopulation would lead to global scarcities of food, and encouraging agricultural self-help in countries like Afghanistan. The dysfunction of the Afghan parliamentary system now led the Americans to press for more drastic measures to bolster the economy. On the one hand, to their credit, they did obtain authorization to make a sizable grain sale to alleviate shortages in Afghanistan. More troublingly, however, as the crisis became undeniable, they linked that shipment to major agricultural reforms. The Nixon administration, which was also waging an intensifying war on illicit drugs, pressed Afghanistan to pursue a number of anti-narcotics policies to arrest opium trafficking and cultivation, and made it clear, without saying as many words, that this had to do with the grain shipment. Much of the world was by this point distracted by the looming Indo-Pakistani crisis that, of course, brought war at the end of 1971. Food relief streamed into Afghanistan. Its distribution within the country posed a very difficult challenge. The famine was best monitored in the cities, but its worst effects were felt in rural Afghanistan, in mountainous regions such as the provinces of Ghor, Badghis, Faryab, and Uruzgan. Here again, U.S. officials sought to tie relief to the attainment of pre-existing goals. They put strings upon relief. Advised by U.S. and also West German experts, the Afghan government inaugurated a relief program called Food for Work. In exchange for laboring on rural public works projects, Afghans would receive donations of wheat. The program effectively elevated foreign development objections over relief. It also assumed some correlation between hunger and labor supply. In fact, many able-bodied Afghans had already left the countryside to find work in the cities. Those remaining in the countryside would often be too old, too weak, or too young to work on public works projects. Poor planning, material shortages, and graft further undermined the program. It was finally jettisoned after a crowd of starving workers besieged several high-ranking officials, including basically the vice premier, in the city of Chowk Charan, only dispersing after the governor pledged to open his grain storehouse. Months later, the Afghan army swung directly into action, dispensing food without preconditions to hundreds of thousands of ill-nourished people. For disaffected young Afghan officers, their government's failure to address the famine constituted reason to act. In July 1973, a group of left-leaning officers allied with Daoud to overthrow the king while he recuperated from eye surgery in Italy. Daoud and his allies formed a very uneasy coalition, Many stood to his left, and some indeed held Marxist sympathies. The United States worked to reassure its Iranian and Pakistani allies in the wake of the coup, but ultimately chose once again to engage Daoud. Extravagant financial promises by the Shah of Iran, who was enjoying the proceeds of an oil boom, helped to entice Afghanistan once again toward détente with Pakistan. Daoud's relations with the Marxists frayed until early 1978. In early 1978, a confrontation between the two of them appeared imminent. In desperation, in April 1978, the Marxists struck first, seizing power in a violent coup on April 27 and murdering Daoud and his family in the presidential palace early on the following morning. Inexorably, but not immediately, the Marxist coup and the establishment of the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan foretold the end of the U.S.-Afghan relationship. The ascendant People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan baffled U.S. observers. President Jimmy Carter opined that the United States should build a good relationship with the government, but proceed cautiously. And there's little evidence to think that he paid much attention to Afghan policy before the coup of 1978. Aid programs continued on a provisional basis, while Washington and its envoys assessed the regime, and they were often baffled. What are we dealing with? Asked the State Department's David Newsom after a meeting with the regime's leaders, Nur Mohammad Taraki and Hafizullah Amin, in July of 78. Is it an inexperienced group of genuine reformers feeling their way? Are Amin and Taraki dedicated communists, masking their intentions? Hint, it's the latter. His administration reached fundamental conclusions, though, by early 1979. The DRA had an appalling human rights record, which often entailed abuses against individuals well known and liked by Americans, figures involved with previous governments. That was one indication of its tendencies. So was the strange killing of the U.S. ambassador Adolph Dubs during an apparent kidnapping in February 1979, an episode that Amin and Taraki failed utterly to explain to Washington's satisfaction. A visibly distraught President Carter consoled the widow of the ambassador and the ambassador's daughter upon his return to Andrews Air Force Base early that year. The DRA, meanwhile, faced a growing insurgency, which had begun over the summer of 1978 and exploded the following March when the western city of Herat had its entire garrison mutiny against the government, killing several Soviet advisors and, of course, greatly alarming the Brezhnev Politburo. Afghanistan's descent into civil war could hardly have occurred at a more fraught time. Revolution in Iran had caught the Carter administration off guard. Washington's relationship with Pakistan remained unsettled by the overthrow of Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto and Islamabad's unfettered nuclear ambitions. Allies ranging from Turkey to China, meanwhile, charged that Moscow was advancing toward the Persian Gulf through Afghanistan. In December 1978, National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski had described an arc of crisis, his phrasing, stretching from Bangladesh to the Arabian Peninsula. He and his peers also perceived a domestic crisis of credibility as a string of unrelated events, ranging from the Iranian Revolution to the Chinese invasion of Vietnam, unsettled voters in early 1979. The administration believed itself to be on the defensive at home and abroad. False Soviet accusations of U.S. involvement in the Herat uprising struck a raw nerve. Moscow was meanwhile also rhetorically exploiting the Iranian Revolution. What are we doing? Asked Vice President Walter Mondale about Afghanistan about a week after Herat. This is a case where the Russians have gotten themselves at odds with the Muslims, and the point ought to be made. Sitting in on an NSC meeting 2 weeks later, Mondale amplified the message. This Afghanistan issue poses a good opportunity for us. It is embarrassing to them. It will be nice for us to be seen on the other side. Bolstered by his presentation, the group recommended exploratory dialogue with Pakistan about assisting the Afghan insurgents. President Carter approved an initial tranche of non-lethal aid and covert broadcasts into Afghanistan in a July 3 presidential finding. What was this final opportunity? Here, it behooves us to avoid, or at least treat very skeptically, explanations tinged by hindsight, such as the notion that Brzezinski sought to lure the Soviets into Afghanistan, and to focus instead on what the documents from 1979 tell us. The Carter administration reeled from a perceived crisis of credibility in early 1979 and sought a means to project resolve to allies within the wider region. Rhetorically and then materially opposing the Soviet-allied regime in Kabul afforded one means of doing so. To the most alarmist voices within the administration, there was no question of Moscow immersing itself into Afghan affairs. It was doing so already. Brzezinski spoke in April about the Soviet takeover, his words, of Afghanistan. Carter's July 3 finding described the Afghan insurgents as attempting to regain their country's sovereignty. For the hawks, for Brzezinski especially, Moscow's intentions were clear. The only real question was what price it would pay for an ongoing active expansion. Afghanistan could be a showcase of U.S. resolve against further Soviet incursions along the arc of crisis, and it could publicize the repressive, atheistic nature of communism. It would play that role for the remainder of the Cold War. To conclude, Washington's repeated pursuit of opportunity in Afghanistan attests to the power of several distinct factors across the 20th century. Firstly, the abilities and charms of Afghan diplomats and officials demands attention. Bridging distance and culture, Afghans repeatedly succeeded in enlisting the sympathies and interests of Americans. Years later, that group would speak with remarkable warmth about their time in Afghanistan. This was something I encountered personally when interviewing people who'd been to Afghanistan in one capacity or another. Afghan outreach elicited forceful and sympathetic responses and tied directly to the next factor. Secondly, we should consider the power of ideology, of notions specifically of American mission. Affinity for Afghanistan impelled diplomats like Engert and Steves onward, sometimes in frustration, but sometimes also to great effect. It may surprise us, but they perceived a compatibility of aims and spirit with the Afghans they encountered. So too did the technicians present in the 1970s during the famine feel that way, however ill-considered their counsel. Others, however, acted from narrower motivations. Before the Second World War, the Afghans had drawn a curious range of entrepreneurs. After the war, Morris and Knudson's reckless pursuit of Afghan opportunity bore myriad implications, virtually all of them disastrous. In this, it could hardly have been unique, and much work, I think, remains to be done on the diplomatic implications of comparative private ventures elsewhere during the Cold War and afterward. Lastly, even as the United States retreats from Afghanistan, we should consider the repeated ways by which Americans and others viewed the country as a potential showcase for agricultural technology, education, political reform, and lastly, ultimately, containment. Its location and the symbolic importance accorded to it rendered Afghanistan a canvas for grand designs. This was true in Cornelius Engert's day, and it was true 6 decades later, after the September 11 attacks. Americans may no longer perceive opportunity in Afghanistan, but others can and will. It behooves us now, as much as it did earlier, to understand this country and to grapple realistically with its challenges and possibilities. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. Do not forget to read the Texas National Security Review, which you can find at tnsr.org.